Hello Philippines and hello classmates, and also to our subject teacher, Miss Sheila Javier. It's September 29, 2021, Wednesday, and this is John Ernel Alabastro, and you're watching GE 102 Reading in Philippine History, presented by BSED 1F Group 1. And now, here is Ms. Bactronal to report the definition and relevance of history.
Thank you, Mr. Alabastro. History is the study of past events. People know what happened in the past by looking at things from the including sources, like books, newspapers, and letters, and artifacts like tools and human or animal remains. The person who studies history is called a historian. The history of the Philippines between 900 and 1565 begins with the creation of the Laguna copper plate, inscription in 900, and ends with Spanish colonization in 1565. And to give us some information about the definition and relevance of history distinction, back to you, Mr. Alabastro.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bactronal. Studying history allows to observe and understand how people and societies behave. For example, we are able to evaluate war even when a nation is at peace by looking back at previous events. And why do we need to study the Philippine history? The reason why we need to study the Philippine history is because it helps us to understand and know the things that happened in the past, and for you to appreciate the future and present situation of the country. And these are the some important reasons why do we need to study the past. The first is to understand the culture. Second is increase understanding in identities and societies. The third is understand the changes. And lastly is we will to learn from mistake in the past. And now, here is Ms. Capile to present the introduction of primary and secondary sources.
Thank you so much for that information, Mr. Alabastro. Historians had important research tools called historical sources. Historical sources, also known as historical material or historical data, is original sources that contain important historical information. These sources are something that inform us about history and source as clues in order to study about history. Historical sources can be classified between primary and secondary sources. The classification of the source depends on the historical subject being studied. Here is Ms. Basil to explain and give us more information about primary sources.
Thank you, Ms. Maybelline. Primary sources. Primary sources provide raw information and first-hand evidence. A primary source gives you direct access to the subject of your research. Primary sources are the evidence of history original records or objects created by participants or observers at the time historical events occurred or even while after events, as in memoirs and oral histories. Primary sources will usually be the main objects of your analysis. If you are researching the past, you cannot directly access it yourself. So you need primary sources that were produced at the time by participants or witnesses. Research field primary source. History, letters and diaries, photographs and video footage, official documents and records, physical objects, art and literature, novels and poems, paintings and arts installations, films and performances, communication and social studies, interviews, transcripts, recordings of speeches, newspapers and magazines, social media posts, law and politics, court records, legal texts, government documents, sciences, empirical studies, and statistical data. Here is Ms. Cassil to explain and give us some information about secondary sources.
Thank you for that information, Ms. Busita. Secondary sources describe, discuss, interpret, comment upon, analyze, evaluate, summarize, and process primary sources. A secondary source is generally one or more steps removed from the event or time period and are written or produced after the fact with the benefit of hindsight. Secondary sources often lack the freshness and immediacy of the original materials. On occasion, secondary sources will collect, organize, and repackage primary source information to increase usability and speed of delivery, such as online encyclopedia. Like primary sources, secondary materials can be written or non-written, sounds, pictures, movies, and etc. Example of secondary sources: bibliographies, biographical works, reference books, including dictionaries, encyclopedias, and atlases. Articles from magazines, journals, and newspapers after the event.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cassil. External criticism is the practice of verifying the authenticity of the evidence by examining physical characteristics, consistency with historical characteristics of the time when it was produced, and materials used for the evidence. External criticism is the process by which is to determine whether is a source is authenticated source after it has been subjected to external criticism. External criticism, which is also known as a lower criticism. Aside from that, tools used by historians and exegetes to determine the validity of a document, particularly a document with some sort of historical significance. Here is Ms. Celeste to explain and give us some information about external and internal criticism.
Thank you so much, Ms. Atienza. Internal criticism looks at the truthfulness of the evidence. It looks at the content of the source and examines the circumstances of each production. One of the most scandalous cases of the Philippine history is Hawks Code of Kalantiaw. It is also applied to check the credibility of the documents, whether the given contents is believable or not. It is because many writers will not have adequate knowledge for these given situations. Some will write on these situations with motivation or prejudice. Sometimes they will not reveal the truth for fear of consequences. And now, this is Miss Amelia to discuss the repositories of primary sources.
Thank you, Celeste. Repositories of primary sources. Primary sources may also be unwritten. These may include oral traditions, oral histories, artworks, and artifacts. Traditions and histories or stories transferred through generations may tell us something about the past. Oral histories are accounts given by a persons of events earlier in their life. Often, they are taken by family member, historians, archivists, or other who interview older people in an attempt to document events and lives that might otherwise be forgotten. Examples of primary sources. Some examples of primary source format is archive and manuscript material, photographs, audio recordings, video recordings, films, journals, letters and diaries, speeches, scrapbooks, published books, newspapers, and magazines clippings published at the time, government publications, oral histories, records of organizations, autobiographies and memoirs, printed ephemera, artifacts, exaggerations, clothing, costumes, furniture, research
research data, exaggerations, public opinion polls. And here is Risha May to give us something information for this topic.
Thank you so much, Miss Amalia. Repositories of primary sources. We have a different source of history and data. We all know that there are a lot of fake information around us. So, where we do believe, where we can get a primary source. There are kind of primary sources. Maybe published or unpublished documents. So, where we can get a published document. First, define a published document. Published document is a powerful source of primary sources because it's a pass of examination and checking. Published documents are those are intended for public distribution or use, such as papers, magazines, books, reports, government documents, laws, court decision, and advertisement are some of the examples of published documents. It is passed to chief editor, so it had a checking before it published. It means published document is the one of the authentic and validated repositories of primary sources. Next is unpublished documents. Unlike published ones, may be difficult to locate as they are kept in private hands, may not easily to access by the public. Documents are also confidential and are restricted from public use, like in personal letters which are in possession by the recipients. Published documents is open for the public viewing. Next is the National Archives of the Philippines. Organized under Republic Act number 9470, passed on May 21, 2007, the National Archives of the Philippines, what we call NAP, was established to store, preserve, conserve, and make available to the public and records, papers, periodicals, book, or other items, article, or materials that had been selected for permanent reservation. Trivia: there was no National Archives of the Philippines before. We have a National Museum and National Library. But in May 1, 2007, already made a National Archives because it is no longer enough and there was a classification. Documents here in National Archives, the artifacts in the National Museum, lastly in the National Library are the books like published thesis. That's all. Back to you, Mr. Albastro.
Thank you so much, Miss Anoya. And that's all for today. Good evening and keep safe, everyone.